Hello, in this video I want to continue the conversations that we've been having about racial capitalism and space privatization. This should be the last couple videos that we do for the series, but I've really enjoyed it because I definitely think that, if you haven't kind of realized by now, that I'm really interested in the idea of like racial capitalism and its place on the space privatization topic. I think that it's really important because I think that it is one of the core criticisms that people will kind of go to as they kind of develop what types of arguments are really kind of like good and like the meta for like this particular resolution. And I also think that I asked a lot of critical questions about like both on policy teams and critical teams about like what does our relationship to space kind of like mean for our other kind of like ideals around like humanity and our kind of like values and relationships, like how capitalism becomes exported to other worlds. And so hopefully I'm thinking that this video will kind of be helpful in terms of continuing that, in terms of talking about how critical teams respond to racial capitalism when it's read as a negative criticism to finish out the series, which I think that just requires you to kind of like tune into the last couple of videos that I did talking about racial capitalism, space privatization, because in those videos I talked about racial capitalism as a negative strategy versus like other key teams, and what I think like the kind of key arguments will really come from. And so I'm hoping that this series will help kind of like round out this series in terms of being able to provide like what the best nuanced responses are, and then thinking about, you know, like what are ways that you can kind of like figure out what some of the priorities are versus this argument, so you can start figuring out the type of arguments you need to be making on the framing debate, the thesis debate, things like the link debate, permutation, impact comparison, alternative debating, all of which I think are important facets of how you're just dealing with this like criticism as a whole. And so hopefully this video is kind of like helpful in terms of like building that toolbox and writing out some of the responses that maybe you're already thinking of, or that are already kind of like at the top of your head. I think that when you're trying to just think about like what are some of the base priorities that you should have versus this type of argument in order to respond to it, I think that the first thing is that you really want to frame the question of like what types of like you really want to kind of like frame the judges' values in terms of what they should be looking for at the end of the debate. I feel like a lot of teams from the racial cap side of things will kind of lean into trying to win that it's really a question of materiality in our relationship to the values of capitalism as a whole, which then kind of like makes it a lot harder, I feel like, for teams on this topic to really win. A lot of like what the core kind of like method net benefits are going to be coming out of like a lot of the things that people are reading, which are questions of like imaginations, things that don't like exactly exist, and questions of like immaterial ways of like affectively coming together in order to change the material world around us. And so if that's kind of the case, I feel like being able to win net benefits, that there are some kind of like other concerns beyond like whether or not you kind of like get to organizing, is like really important, and making arguments about like how organizing is not something that is kind of like birthed out of nothing, but is rather imagined by various types of communities from like different types of vantage points before people kind of like enact them into like various types of material tactics. And so being able to kind of like set the record straight in terms of like what that type of like imagination looks like in terms of the affirmative and the way it's kind of leveraged against the criticism, I think is super important in order for you to have like just a strong kind of like opening set of arguments like against this set of like ideas for the criticism. And then I think that additionally being able to try and find ways into thinking about like why, even if your affirmative doesn't really lend itself to being able to end all be all to how people materially organize, that if it's compatible with some of the kind of like values that are being produced by like the alternative and the way that the criticism is thinking of them, then there's room for a permutation of being able to like work in net benefits and different examples that you're able to access that are kind of common ground for you and the other team. Could be another place where you really kind of like find the like benefits to like what the framing debate is doing, and why you're able to kind of find like immediate success out of like holding that argument, and you're kind of like 2AR 2NR is like the centerpiece for like where you kind of want to derive a lot of your offense and a lot of your strategy from, which is like super important. I think that at like just a framing level, a lot of the things that you should try to be accomplishing with your framework debate is trying to like talk about like the value of imaginative work in the context of space, making arguments about like why the way in which we kind of like relate to space requires us to reconfigure the way in which we're kind of like going about our relationship to the spatiality as a whole. The idea that we should see space only as a space that can be like dominated as an inevitable resource is bad, but that doesn't mean that there should not be a view or a relationship that we take up to space that doesn't have to be completely connected to the operationalization of capitalism and the way that it kind of like functions as a particular like set of instruments that are meant to kind of like co-opt these kind of like freedom dreams and things like that. And so you need to make arguments that it's not a question of whether the 1AC is completely outside of capitalism or not, because no alternative to the way in which the world is structured is like outside of the world, but a question of like how does the kind of like investments that the affirmative method hold change the terms for kind of like what our relationship to capitalism is collectively, and thus opens up the room for like various different like collective responses to the problem of capitalism. And making then arguments about like why the kind of like material basis for organization isn't the only place where you kind of like start like what organizing is. And I feel like building that benefits out of these kind of like other facets for what it takes to really think about like what creates organizations, movements, etc., and that like allows you to generate historical examples is like super important in order for you to just have a strong framing argument that like not only is like makes sense at an interpretive level, but also has like net benefits that you can kind of like push in terms of like why the way in which you're thinking about method on method debates and critical debating is super important, because the framing framing arguments and like the debate that you're having over the framing arguments also is like the start of the debate that you'll end up having over things like the permutation, because they kind of like frame how the judge is kind of making their decision in the first place. And so whether or not they give you a permutation, whether or not they're thinking about your affirmative and the alternative through the same lens that you are, requires you to kind of win some of these arguments earlier on. I then think that when you start transitioning into a lot of the thesis questions and thesis concerns, I feel like a lot of the questions are like really based in terms of like, what does your critique of like humanism and the way in which we currently relate to the world of spatialization, how does that relate to a question of capitalism, and what are the ways in which you can pull the nuanced critiques of capitalism that your affirmative probably holds in them, even if like subtle, into the debate, because I think that having them as part of the debate is just super important as a whole in terms of being able to like show the judge a lot of commensurability between your thesis arguments, even if the end of your thesis is that the overfocus on capitalism also isn't the answer to structural violence, which is where I feel like a lot of these kind of like thesis arguments will end up concluding in order to like differentiate themselves from the criticism a bit in order to create and generate offense, which I don't think is a bad thing. I feel like a lot of your arguments can be about like why movements that have done like the most good and have the most like effective kind of like change have done so by being able to understand violence like very texturally and not focusing on one specific kind of like structure of violence in order to understand how different people become like basically how people become more vulnerable to structures of violence as like kind of like time passes. And so making arguments about like how the 1AC kind of like combats that vulnerability on multiple textures, including capitalism, allows you to kind of like separate your offense into like things that you want to win in order to like de-emphasize the idea that a pure focus on capitalism is able to resolve all violence, while still being able to access like arguments about like why potential permutations are viable and what type of like room that kind of like looks like in terms of not only how you're thinking about the world materially, but at like a kind of like theoretical level. How's the judge kind of like understanding the two kind of like ways in which you're studying and thinking about how the world comes to be and our kind of like relationships to space, and where can they kind of find common ground in the way in which you're refuting the same kind of structures of violence, and I think that as you're kind of able to develop a clearer picture of that, the examples then start to become a lot easier to comprehend and a lot heavier in terms of like their weight, because they kind of then prove how that thesis shows up in a material basis, which then can lead you on into some other arguments like link terms, permutations, and things we'll talk about in the last video. So hopefully you'll enjoy this video, and hopefully you'll kind of like tune into the next one. That'll be the last one for Racial Capitalism, Space Privatization. And yeah, thank you as always for tuning in.